Well, hello and welcome to this weekly community call. So this time we have something a bit different for you guys. As you know, we are working on the new version of the Kleros Court, and lots of people ask what this is going to be about, what are the improvements, what is the innovation we have here. Some of you maybe already read the yellow paper that describes the main topics of what's going to be in this court, but of course it's better to have a presentation. So I will just introduce I would say at this point the world famous William George, who is Kleros Research Director, and he will present the main topics that are into the Kleros Court 2.0. So William will make a presentation, and then, of course, feel free to ask all the questions you may need. That's it, William. The stage is yours, and break a leg.
All right, thanks. So thanks for this opportunity to speak. So I'm, as Federico said, I'm going to be talking about some of the things that are planned for the next version of the Kleros Court. So this is the fruit of the research that we've been doing basically since, and even to some degree before the last version of the court launched. And the learnings that we've had, and sort of the plans that we developed as a result of this research, which all of you can read about in the yellow paper, but like I'm going to try to do sort of main ideas. So the first big thing is sort of how the court hopes to handle sort of scalability issues. So it's going to be on a rollup. So for those of you who aren't aware, if anyone's sort of not less plugged into sort of the broader Ethereum sort of ecosystem discussions about scaling, scaling Ethereum has been like a big point of discussion in sort of broader ecosystem because, as you may have noticed, gas fees are quite high. Ultimately, gas fees are high because the transaction capacity of the sort of layer one Ethereum network is limited. Well, why is the layer one capacity of Ethereum limited? Well, it's because miners who are verifying these transactions have to do some kind of computational work. They have to do resources. It takes RAM and storage space and such that they have to be compensated for. And in Ethereum L1, every miner verifies every is verified basically the entire network. So that's a massive duplication of effort, which creates sort of scaling issues. So a lot of the ideas around how to make Ethereum more scalable involve not having everyone verify every transaction while still trying to keep similar security guarantees. So rollups, to give a brief introduction to people who aren't aware or super familiar, are sort of a new scaling solution, which means there's this sort of second consensus layer that's kind of like a blockchain. It's Ethereum, where people will verify transactions that are in a rollup, but not everyone can get that rollup. So the miners on L1 don't look at, they're not verifying all transactions as they come through. And then when you will want to leave the rollup and go back on chain, you can take the result of whatever happened on the rollup, and you can sort of go back to the chain. You can withdraw your tokens or whatever. You can have a result of a Kleros case on a rollup that then is validated. They can sort of seen by the chain. And the sort of characteristic of a rollup is compared to some other sort of L2 scaling solutions like Plasma, is that all transactions are still represented as call data on chain. So this means there's sort of the L1 consensus, the L1 miners and such, they see the transaction, but they don't bother to do the computation to actually validate it. So it requires less computational resources for them, but it still requires some computational resources because they're still they see this data coming in. And there are a couple of varieties of rollup available. There's optimistic rollup, where so there are two big varieties: optimistic rollup and zk rollup. And the difference is how you handle making sure what happens on the rollup. The state updates on L1 actually represent what happened on the rollup. So on an optimistic rollup, people sort of propose sets of state updates to L1 and say, okay, I now have this many tokens because that's what's happened on the optimistic rollup. And if somebody disagrees, someone has followed the rollup consensus, is no, that's not right. They can challenge it. So there's this idea of this sort of proposing state updates with a deposit and a long challenge period that can then be invalidated. And then the L1 consensus can use the call data to figure out what was actually the correct like who's right, whether the challenge is correct or not. Whereas ZK rollups have sort of a different approach. There, the state updates are verified sort of like beforehand as they happen by having a ZK proof that says, okay, like you're not going to have to execute all of this transaction, but I have this like zero knowledge proof that if you did, this would be the result. So that's uses cooler technology. They don't have these like long withdrawal periods. There's sort of pluses and minuses and trade-offs between the two schemes. So like when Kleros is picking a rollup to go live on, like what are the priorities and requirements for Kleros? Well, ideally would be EVM compatible. We have lots of Solidity smart contracts in Kleros that are, you know, like would be complicated to convert into new like a new language or like a sort of like a more limited sort of programming structure. So ideally you just like use Solidity code. And to the degree possible, you want to be on a platform where other dApps are also using Kleros, because even if to the degree that you sort of facilitate intercommunication between different rollups, which is something I'm going to hit on in a second, like the communication between like Kleros, the court, and like a dApp, well, that's using Kleros as a dispute resolution platform, will always be the smoothest if they're in the same place. And then generally you want like mature tooling and, you know, good random number generators and such. So currently all of the like leading projects that I sort of indicate here, Optimism and Arbitrum and ZK Sync, they're all in various states of not quite being mature, but getting there. So for example, Optimism has a mainnet deployment, but in order to deploy a smart contract on it, you have to get whitelisted on a centralized whitelist. So generally they're like points of centralization that they're slowly unwinding as they're becoming more mature. And there are audits that haven't been fully completed yet. They have a fully decentralized testnet. You know, like in theory, there shouldn't be any main roadblocks to using Optimism. The other projects are sort of similar. ZK Sync similarly has a mainnet where you can't deploy a smart contract yet, and they're like developing sort of better compilers for both Solidity and their sort of custom made language Zinc, which should be sort of more more efficient with their network. So like we don't entirely know which of these platforms we're ultimately going to go on, because it depends sort of on things beyond Kleros, which one is the most ready, like, and when. It's probably still most likely to be Optimism. They seem to be most likely to be sort of mature and where we need them to be when we want them to be there. But because we're going for a rollup that's EVM compatible and can use Solidity code, like on some level it shouldn't matter. You should just like, you should be able to develop the next version of the court in Solidity, and then up to sort of like small changes that are rollup dependent, you should be able to deploy to any of these depending on which one's available at the time. So like a lot of that touches on research that is sort of beyond us, what people have doing elsewhere in the ecosystem to have scalability solutions. And then some research that we've had taught on this point, sort of like what will Kleros look like in a rollup world. There's some noise on the channel there. Okay, thanks.
1 second. How do we mute people? Can you mute everyone? Mute, please, or can you do it, Annabelle? Yeah.
I think it's the
Yeah,
guy made the.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So some of the research we've done, like the sort of more specific to us, like most of the sort of broader rollup questions are sort of things that are going on, research is happening more broadly in the ecosystem, are what will Kleros look like in a rollup world? In particular, like how will communication happen between different rollups and specifically between Kleros and dApps that don't live in the same place? And ultimately, this is like a key question, because if every dApp, every smart contract that is migrated to the rollup, you create the same scalability problems in the rollup that you currently have on Ethereum. So the sort of rollup approach to scaling only works to the degree that like you fragment the world, like that there are things on one rollup and other things on some other rollup and some things on L1. And Kleros is a kind of like middleware project that's providing dispute resolution to apps, you know, a variety of different apps that might have disputes. Ideally, you should be able to do so in, you know, across the ecosystem. we've thought about ways that you can sort of facilitate Kleros rulings being enforced across rollup, from the rollup to L1, for example, like Kleros on L2 to a decision being made on L1. So we have various structures for how we imagine this being facilitated. So the sort of diagram here illustrates one of them. So if you imagine like Kleros is on the L2, and the application that you want to rule on is on L1, then the approach that we've sort of developed here is that you, so if L2 specifically is an optimistic rollup, this is less relevant for non-optimistic rollup. So normally, in order to take the dispute, is there a question?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So okay, I'm still activated. Okay. So normally in order. So normally, if you have a ruling on L2, there would be like a 1 to 2 week finalization time before anything that on L2 happens could be seen by L1. So if your contract is sitting on L1 waiting for the ruling, that's not amazing to have like an extra 2 week of delay. But a structure that we've thought about is to have like a contract, like a read layer contract on L1, that you can make claims about rulings that have happened on L2 along with some deposit, and say, okay, like, I know that you as L1, you can't see this ruling yet, but in 2 weeks it's coming, and Alice won the case. So you can put down a deposit and saying Alice won the case that's then challengeable, and you can have like a shorter delay time. So this is like a similar structure to how optimism itself works, in this like sort of like claim challenge mechanism, but you can have timeout periods that are more adapted to Kleros, whereas optimism has to take like a really long conservative challenge period because like there's like all kinds of applications on it. Whereas here you can have something that's more adapted to sort of the security questions of Kleros, so like maybe you only have a day delay. And if somebody does challenge my claim that Alice won of the dispute, then you actually wait the full 2 weeks. And you can get your message from L2 that will say, okay, Alice actually won. So this person that like challenged me, they lost a deposit, and I get rewarded from their deposit, or vice versa if Alice had lost. So, like normally in the happy path, you don't add like too long an extra delay, even though despite this sort of like long challenge period that optimism would have, or optimistic rollup in general would have. You can in like an extreme case if somebody challenges something as like a grief. But ultimately, like Kleros has always been sort of a dispute resolution platform that's like usually fast but long if you're unlucky, because there can always be like extra appeals. So this like fact that you might have to wait longer is something that's sort of built into your expectations when you're using Kleros anyway. So that sort of gets at the roll-up questions and the scaling questions. So if anybody has specific questions, feel free to jump in. But moving on to sort of the other points of what's going to be what other research we've done, then we'll go into the next version of the court. We expect the next version of the court to have a sort of modular design. So like using proxy contracts, which are sort of more available now than they were when the previous version of the court was launched. You can potentially have different voting, different incentive, and different appeal structures that can be like plugged in later through some kind of proxy contract. To the degree that they're approved by the governance process, they can be like launched after the sort of core of the court launches. Like you can imagine that someone writes like a smart contract that encodes some new voting system, a new incentive system, and then somewhere later down the line, the governance process will approve that as being like, yes, this is this voting incentive structure that like makes sense for Kleros and that we're willing to rule cases in. So this sort of modular approach, it creates flexibility for different use cases. It also means that the court can kind of launch gradually. So like the initial launch might just be sort of the roll-up part with this sort of like broader modular skeleton, and then like the simplest kinds of voting systems. So similar to the kind of voting systems we already have. Which leads me into my next point of like, what are our current voting systems and like, what are the future voting systems going to look like? So currently in Kleros, we use something called plurality voting, or first past the post voting, which means that, say there are multiple options that jurors can choose between, Alice, Bob, Charles, whatever, maybe like Bob gets like a partial refund, or, the freelancer gets more time or whatever to finish the project. So I have like a whole bunch of options, and I can vote for one, and then you look at the option that gets the most votes. So this is very, this is like this most standard voting system that most people I think are like sort of most familiar with, particularly in political elections. But for Kleros and for shallow point systems, it's not amazing when you have an expectation that there'll be more than two sort of plausible outcomes. So in most of the applications of Kleros at this point have maybe not been like actually binary. There may have been more than two options, but they've usually been sort of de facto binary. There's usually only been like two sort of plausible outcomes that we could realistically expect. Because you imagine if like the honest votes are split between a whole bunch of similar options or sort of plausible options, then that means the plurality winner only gets 30% or 20% or something in the vote. So that lowers your threshold to 51% attacks. Maybe your attacker can get through with 30% if like the rest of the vote is sort of split enough. So how can we improve upon that? So we've done a lot of research that draws on social choice theory and these sort of like existing academic discipline and research that people have been doing for decades on how does one have a good voting system? Like what's a voting system that will like work well, particularly around sort of vote splitting effects. And most of the social choice theorists have been thinking in terms of sort of traditional political elections, the kind of elections where you elect your president or your prime minister or something, where you're voting an expression of your preferences. Like, I want so-and-so to be president, which is not exactly the situation we're in here. Like, we're like in Kleros, we have this sort of different set of mechanism where you're incentivized to try to have this, vote for this sort of like broad consensus, like opinion of what the truth is. But nonetheless, we can adapt a lot of the research that people have done in social choice theory to the sort of like slightly different structure that we have. So the sort of first rule, the first sort of observation you notice if you study social choice theory is that there's no perfect voting system. Like every voting system has like its pluses and minuses. And you see charts like this one, or you have like a bunch of voting systems. So here we have them down the rows down on the left, and a bunch of properties one would hope the voting system had. Here we have them sort of the column headers going across the right. And there's trade-offs. Like one thing will have this, but not that, and the other voting system will have that, but not this. And you kind of have to pick what voting system is like the least worst, based on the priorities that you have in your use case. So here, this is sort of the chart from our perspective, for Kleros' perspective, about properties that we care about. The voting systems are pretty similar. We mostly studied sort of existing voting rules according to their sort of like new priorities. And the voting system that I think probably is like the most likely to be like a solid choice for Kleros on like average cases. This modularity allows you to like maybe use some things for some applications, some things for others, but like the sort of bread and butter, the like most resistant that we've come up with, at least based on research so far, is this wood SIRV, which is a sort of adapted version of instant runoff. Instant runoff being the row immediately above. So if you're not familiar with instant runoff, it's a voting system that's used in Australian parliamentary elections. It's also used by the Academy Awards. So all of these, so I'll show some examples. So all of the voting systems that I just considered there are types of ranked choice voting. There are other things that you can do that are sort of also considered by social choice theory, but for the moment, like we limit ourselves to ranked choice voting, where instead of just ranking, like having one option that you're like, yeah, this is the good option. Now you provide a richer set of information to the voting system. You say, okay, like I think A is the best option, but C is also okay, B is okay, and D is terrible. So you provide a ranking that says that, and then the voting system processes that into a result. So as an example, you can imagine that you had votes like this. So say 4 people vote A, B, C, D, 2 people vote B, C, D, A, etc. And like a naive thing that you might want to do, or that you could try that runs into problems, is to look for an option that beats every other option head to head. You're like, okay, this is like this complicated information people are going to about their vote preferences, but I can look through the different options. I can be like, okay, just comparing A to B, like A beats A is ranked ahead of B is like in 8 votes, and B is ranked ahead of B in 3 votes. So in some sense, A is better than B. And I can do the same thing for B to C, and I can be like, okay, B beats C 7-4, C beats A 7-4. Oh wait, so according to this sort of like dual logic, A is better than B, which is better than C, which is better than A. So this is called a Condorcet paradox. So this was like a phenomenon that was studied by Nicolas de Condorcet, who was like an early social choice theorist who studied voting theorems in the 18th century. So like you're sort of like looking just by like looking at who wins all pairwise duels doesn't work because there is no option like that. So in Wood SIRV, what you can do is you can say, okay, I'm going to look for a Condorcet winner. I'm going to look for an option to beat everybody else in a pairwise duel. And oh, dang, there isn't one. So I'm going to, if there is, then that option wins. And if there isn't, then you eliminate whoever gets the fewest first place votes, and then you repeat. So here, C got the fewest first place votes. So you just sort of pretend that C is no longer people's votes. So like the people at the top voted A, B, D now. C doesn't exist anymore. And then you do the same process where you look in the sort of the pairwise duels between the remaining options. And then you realize, oh, there's a Condorcet winner now, like A beat B, and then A also beat D. So A should be my winner. So as I said, this is sort of an adapted version of instant runoff voting, because in instant runoff voting, you don't do this Condorcet step first. You just eliminate whoever gets the fewest first place votes, and you keep reattributing people's first place votes until eventually somebody wins. So this is kind of like a mix of a Condorcet approach and it is a Condorcet approach, but it's like a mix of a Condorcet step with an instant runoff step. So maybe going back to my like table as a trade-offs, the reasons we chose this basically are that like Condorcet, beyond being sort of like a natural property you might want a voting system to have, has a lot of attack resistance positive properties that I'll get into a little bit when I talk about the incentive system that we're going to use. So it's good to be Condorcet, but then really you can't just, you have to pick some kind of tiebreak rule for your Condorcet system. The instant runoff has good attack resistance, basically. That's sort of the logic. Okay, so that tells you how to determine who the winner is. But now you have this other question, this related question of how much people should be rewarded or penalized. Okay, A1, I voted A third. Am I coherent? Am I incoherent? Should I be rewarded, penalized? It's unclear. So you have to sort of ask yourself, what should be the incentive system that would go with a voting system like this? And it's expressed here in these sort of like scary looking, but not too really complicated formulas that are on the slide. So the basic idea of the incentive system that we're going to implement is that you look at sort of pairwise duels again between the winner, so in this case A, and every other option, and you look at how jurors did on those duels. Like how many options basically rank ahead of or behind the winner. The sort of twist on that, the one sort of non-trivial thing about this, is that I weight different options differently. So I have these weighting functions, and this might become clear when I talk about an example. Maybe I should go to this slide and come back. So A1, so I should compare it to each of B, C, and D. And I use this sort of like formula to determine a weight for B, C, and D. And basically what that means is that higher weighted options will be worth more in payoffs and penalties. If I get the really highly weighted option wrong, if I rank D ahead of A, as D winds up being the sort of most highly rated one here, then that means that counts more towards my incentives than if I got like A versus D wrong. And the sort of logic, like we similarly have trade-offs around what weighting function to pick, and we have like a sort of similar table to before. And here, so just to briefly hit on what some of these deal with. So there's like first winner max payout thing. So you notice all of them have this. We designed the system around this constraint, but it's sort of worth hitting on anyway. Like if you rank the winner first, according to sort of this design logic, you should get the maximum payoff. It shouldn't matter what you rank second, third, fourth, whatever. So if you're like really, really sure that Alice, wins, and you're just comfortable ranking that first and nothing else, like you should be able to do that and not have any kind of incentive penalty. So this, the sort of like logic around this is from like a UX perspective. You don't want people to have to think about sort of irrelevant options. You know, if everyone was like a robot, maybe they could, you know, you could expect them to provide a full ranking of options, but in like reality, that's annoying. And you only want to have to provide a a partial ranking up to the options you think are sort of relevant. And as long as the winner is in those relevant options you rank, then that shouldn't matter for your incentives. The sort of concentration on close pairs, both of the other two properties around attack resistance, to sort of be more resistant to kinds of attacks that we anticipate people could launch against Kleros, 51% attacks, you know, people's attacks, whatever. So this concentration on close pairs comes from a sort of like design philosophy, which people see elsewhere
Estoy
in
escuchando
sort of,
a Williams. Oh, estás disponible, me dice la concha de la hora.
Okay, wait, let's mute people. 1 second. And
okay, so I will continue. So this concentration of on close pairs comes from a sort of design logic that you see elsewhere in Ethereum, that narrow attacks should cost more. And this is also like, you see this in like two design, that, you know, sometimes people are just wrong by, you know, by random chance, not malicious, you know, they judge the case wrong, you know, they, you know, like it's sort of a subjective case and they don't wind up with a consensus opinion. They like, you know, from the ETH perspective, they're like validator went offline for, you know, an hour or something. And you shouldn't try to penalize those people too much to the degree that they make honest mistakes. But like how you distinguish an honest mistake from an attack, that's hard. But one thing that you can do is you can distinguish like an attack that comes quite close to making a difference, that like, you know, like the most dangerous attacks are the ones that almost work. So you can penalize things that look like narrowly missed attacks more than you can penalize other things. So this sort of concentration on close pairs basically says that, you know, like if an option almost changes the result, it should be like the stake should be higher. Because that way, if the attacker like tries to change the result and fails, they'll lose more. Going back to the example, so like the margin between A and D was the closest in the other between the other versus the other two margins. So as you see, the sort of weight is the highest out of the three weights, plugging into this weighting formula that I have here. And then when I look at like the results for people's incentives, this person who put A first, well, they don't lose any deposit because they were right. They got the winner right. These other people, they lose a bit of deposit and they'll get a bit of payout. You know, like the lost deposit might be more or less in the payoff depending on like, you know, the situation. And you can see that the people who got like the person on the second line here, the 2 votes on the second line, they got A versus D right. And we said that was the most important pair because it was the closest. Whereas the bottom 2 categories, they got A versus D wrong. And you can see correspondingly, like the second category loses less deposit than the other 2. And then similarly, like they get a higher reward than the other 2 because they got the most important pair right. So that's sort of the design logic around the incentives. Okay, so that's like the biggest change that involved the most research, but there are a lot of other sort of like important changes that I will briefly, hopefully, go through. So we intend to make some changes to the crowdfunding mechanism. So like the crowdfunding is going to be moved to the arbitrator side. Instead of currently every arbitrable app, every like app that uses Kleros dispute resolution can decide how it wants to handle crowdfunding. It can decide more generally how it wants to sort of handle the appeal structure. If you move the crowdfunding and the appeals, like appealing mechanism to the arbitrator side, it's the actual court contract, then you can, one, take into account when the final juror vote differs from when the alternative that wins is because it's funded, but no other alternatives are, which, you know, maybe allows you to sort of like kind of split the difference in incentives in that case, which can, you know, sort of smooth over some rough edges, and then we've seen in the current version. You can also create incentives and rewards for people who fund an alternative that then wins without a dispute. If people sort of, you know, say like a small panel of jurors, 3 or something, vote for something that's like the community thinks of is pretty clearly wrong, and there's an appeal where the people fund the option that people think is clearly right, and then nobody bothers to fund the other option or another option, like, you know, like ideally there'd be some reward for people having done this appealing, even though there's no subsequent dispute, to compensate them for like the gas they spend and the sort of capital lockup. So you can create a small reward for that. So more broadly, your appeal mechanism also kind of has issues that come when we have multiple choices. Because if you think about it, like crowdfunding, appealing is kind of like a kind of voting. You're saying, okay, like these are the options that I think are worthy that I should crowdfund or not, and these are the ones that I like think are terrible that should be crowdfunded against. And again, from like the rich history of social choice theory, that voting is complicated when you have more than two choices. You have to think about like what happens in this situation too. And you don't want contributions to be too split over good options so that none of them is funded. Like here, you have your three honest options, and each of them gets like some funding, but none of them get to the line to be totally funded. So like none of them is funded, which is not ideal. So what you kind of want to do is you want to be able to fund like all options collectively. You want to be able to say, okay, like these options in the middle, they're the good options. Like any one of them is fine. I'm just going to fund them together. And the crowdfunding that we've researched that will eventually probably be deployed as part of the core contract, a module, probably not going to be with the initial release, attempts to do this, where I can fund more options together. There are constraints and limitations on that. So notably, there's like a sort of intrinsic king of the hill structure in how appeals work. Like if no option is funded, then the previous round winner wins. So the previous round winner is sort of like the king of the hill. But if somebody like funds one option, that places the previous round winner as the default option, unless somebody funds some other option and there's a subsequent dispute. So like if you allow people to fund multiple options in sort of this like first stage where like the first thing is being crowdfunded, then like if you allow people to fund multiple options in this kind of first half when you're not necessarily going to have another round of the dispute, you can have situations where people fund like a batch of options that have some honest options and some malicious options. And like, because there's some honest options, nobody bothers to crowdfund them against them. But like, there's a malicious option in there. Like once, there's not a dispute, you have to determine who actually won and what option is going to be implemented. So like, how do you distinguish between like good options that were sort of in the basket of crowdfunding versus the malicious options? If you like pick an option randomly or something, you can get the malicious one. So you kind of have to just like restrict people to funding a single option in the kind of first half of a crowdfunding period. And then once somebody's funded one option, you can allow people to fund like a collective of a set of options against the first option. So if that seems complicated, I have just like the sort of mock-ups of the UI that Plinio has developed for this. So like you sort of have the phase one on the left here and phase two on the right. And on phase one, it looks very similar to the current crowdfunding, where you just pick an option. And if no option gets fully funded, then the previous plan winner wins. But when you get to phase two, so now there's a new default option because it's been funded, and I can fund, you'll notice, multiple options. I can say, okay, pay 230 DAI, pay 190 DAI, either of those is fine, I fund like them together. And then there are sort of complicated formulas that determine like your payoffs or your penalties, penalties, rewards, depending on what happens, like in what you fund. It's somewhat more complicated than the current set of formulas because if you like, say, pay 190 DAI wins, if I put that in my basket of things like crowdfunding and I'm right, I get a reward, but I don't get quite as big a reward if I just founded that alone. Because I've like hedged, I put this other option in. So I like went out less on a limb that for 190 DAI than like if I had just funded that by itself. So if anybody really cares, I have the formula as a sort of a bonus slide, but I didn't think they really added much to the talk. But there's a formula that determines what you get, like depending on like what you fund, if the winner's in your set, and sort of how many other things you fund. And there's like, as you can sort of see in the mock-up here, there's a little calculator where you can simulate what the different situations. You'll say, okay, if like this option wins based on these funding options, what do I get? That would then take in the formulas and sort of tell you, case by case. Okay, so a couple other points. We plan to have proof of humanity screened courts. So these are courts where in order to be a juror, to be picked as a jury, you need to be registered on Proof of Humanity, and then you can restrict people to having one vote per human. So like you can use this like new civil resistance mechanism, this Proof of Humanity, to limit the number of votes people have per address, per human being, in a way that like can't just be gained by people splitting up their tokens over multiple addresses, which is why you couldn't have done this in a pre-Proof of Humanity time. Not every court will be like that. So which civil resistant mechanism you use can vary from court to court. We envision this being sort of a parameter that you can turn on or off from one court to another. Particularly, we wouldn't want to use this for courts that decide proof of humanity cases themselves. So either proof of the humanity court or like its appeal courts, the general court, because then you would have like circular security guarantees. If some attacker broke the proof of humanity, then suddenly they control, the like mechanisms allowing them to judge cases on new proof of humanity cases. So there's like a snowball effect where it's really hard to get the attacker sort of, to move them out of the system. But for other courts, this is like a valuable civil liaison mechanism. So we have some anti-proof researchers on anti-proof relation. So this is this issue that like how seeing other people's votes might influence how you vote, and how we should encourage people to how we should ideally create a system where people's vote information doesn't circulate while other people are still voting, and to the degree that it does, where it doesn't influence people too much. So if you want more information on this topic, I recommend you check out a talk I gave recently at ECC, where I just talk about this. So as you're probably aware, currently votes are public. You can see them on Kleros Court in real time. In most courts, basically every court, there are a couple of courts where this is activated now, where you already have sort of a commit and reveal mechanism, which I'll recall if anyone is sort of unfamiliar with commit and reveal. For reasons that I sort of discuss in my ECC talk, if anyone's interested, there are incentives for people not to just herd vote and vote for the options they already see people voting for. But nonetheless, it'd be better if that information didn't circulate. And there are sort of two issues with this that need to be solved to make like a good sort of anti-proof relation mechanism and a good commit and reveal. And the one, commit and reveal has sort of user X problems that I will hit on in a second. You have to come back and perform a second action, which is kind of annoying from a UX perspective. And then moreover, it's not enough just to allow people to hide their vote. To give people a way to hide their vote, you also have to incentivize them not to reveal their vote anyway. So expanding on these points, so commit and reveal is this idea that instead of having a vote period where I just publish my vote, I have a 2-period sort of system of vote period and then a reveal period, where in the vote period, I take a random value, I take my vote, I hash them together, and I take that hash value and I put it on chain. And then during the reveal period, I publish my vote and the random value. And the contract can check that matches the hash value. And I couldn't have voted a different way and still have the same hash value, short of breaking a hash function. So I have cryptographic guarantees that person actually voted this way. So this is already implemented in the current version of the court, but it's, as I sort of already said, it's turned off in most courts. There's a parameter from one court to another determines whether it's on or off. And the reason that this is not more widely currently used, that we hope to address so that it'll be more widely used in the future. So first there was this issue of user X. If this person had to come back and do a second action, and if they forget to do their second action, well, they're slashed for having not revealed, which is not great if they actually voted. Maybe they were on a plane or their computer died or whatever, and they couldn't come back and do the vote revelation. So in a centralized system, in the old world, what you could imagine doing is just having a centralized database that tracks everybody's votes, keeps them to himself, keeps them secret, and then publishes them all at an appointed time. You can't do that here in a decentralized system. At least it's highly non-obvious to do that, because nobody knows your vote except for you. That's decentralization. Nobody else knows your vote. So one approach to allow sort of votes that kind of automatically reveal is based on something called threshold encryption. So here the idea is that there's a public key, private key pair, where the public key is known to everyone, but the private key is sharded. It's split into pieces, into shares, using a sort of Shamir secret sharing kind of scheme. And then in order to reconstruct the private key, you need n out of m shares. So what you can do is you can encrypt your vote under the public key that everybody knows, and then in the reveal period, somehow some key keepers reveal their key shares. So here they're the other jurors, but they could be other third actors. Individual key keepers don't know your votes. unless they collude somehow between each other. But like assuming n out of m key keepers eventually publish their share, you can restrict everybody's vote. So this is an approach that can be used. Conveniently, there are threshold encryption schemes that don't require a trusted third-party setup, which would kind of defeat the point, that were pioneered by Peterson like 20 years ago. And even more conveniently, there's a crypto project called Shutter, which is currently implementing such a thing as a sort of like a front-running, anti-front-running tool. They see it as like a DeFi, mostly like a DeFi application, where like I have like a front-running protected order book where I submit my DeFi transaction, and then they're all revealed by the threshold encryption system, whether I want my transaction to be revealed or not. Like a little while later, and I can't front-run too much because like everything is everything was under this like threshold encryption. But you can plug Kleros into the same system. So hopefully, at some point, like when Shutter is available, like you could just plug, like you could just put this on top of the Court. Like you don't really have to modify the Court contract, so it could just be activated later, even if the Court contract is already deployed. A sort of shorter term alternative temporary approach would be to have a device that just reveals your vote for you. So nobody knows your vote except for you, but my phone is sort of an extension of myself. So if like, the device I use to make my commitment, it kind of knows my vote. So maybe it just like automatically reveals the vote at a given time. And that works as long as my phone isn't off, like in the camping or something. So it's still not like a perfect solution, but like can usually prevent people from having to make this like second manual action in revealing their vote. The more important issue, as I sort of already got at, was how do you incentivize people to not just reveal the vote anyway? Like if people think that revealing the vote helps them win the case, helps their side win the case, then like they'll just do that anyway if they commit reveal or not. So like this is only sort of an effective mechanism to the degree that there are consequences for doing that. And what we intend to do, like what we based on our research, is to have a special court that judges jurors for misbehavior, basically. So now, in addition to having a deposit as a juror that you can like lose if you're incoherent with the result, you have another part of your sort of min stake, another piece of your deposit that will that you can lose if someone accuses you of misbehavior in this juror court and you're convicted by Kleros jurors in this sort of new secondary case for having broken juror guidelines. So here, like, someone can challenge you and say, okay, like, this dude, he pre-revealed, I have evidence. I have some timestamp of him publishing, like his vote somewhere, of his salts, whatever, some credible commitment that he of his vote. And then the jurors can look at that and they can say, yeah, he violated juror guidelines. And then part of his deposit goes to this other person. Why do we need like a court to do that rather than having some kind of automated mechanism? Well, because pre-revelation of vote turns out to be like a really sort of like multi-form thing. You can pre-reveal your vote in lots of ways. You can publish your salts. You can like publish your like a ZK proof that you have a salt. You can create some elaborate contract that slashes yourself if you don't vote in a given way. And just because there's like so many different ways that you can pre-reveal, like there's no automated mechanism that can just check and be like, yep, he pre-revealed, he should be penalized. Really, you need sort of like a subjective judgment of human beings to like look at what you actually did and determine whether you pre-revealed or not. So you can, that's what Kleros is for, subjective judgments. So you do this in a Kleros court. So the another thing that will be present in the next version is a sort of explicit forking mechanism. So currently already, you can imagine if there was like a really contentious case where people felt that like Kleros produced an egregious outcome, someone could just clone the current court and fork it, create a new version of PNK, a new version of the court contract, and create like Kleros B, and like a version of Kleros where they pretend that egregious result had never happened. Maybe there's a 51% attack, and you just cut out the 51% attacker's vote. It doesn't, control the like sort of ETH amounts, so we're like locked up based on the sort of pending results of those the cases in the old court. But you can create a new version of the database of tokens, basically, and sort of the like juror community, and move on for new cases with the new court. So like a sort of social consensus fork. So this new version, this new forking mechanism will basically just like facilitate that process. There'll be like a concrete mechanism in the contract that will like sort of guide people on like when or not they want to fork, in a sort of mechanical way. So here, beyond just submitting a ranked list of alternatives, PNK holders will also include like an alternative that they think they're willing to fork to, and like a threshold at which they're willing to fork to those different alternatives. So like kind of the big idea of this forking mechanism, in contrast particularly to like forking mechanisms like Ogre, which also has an explicit forking mechanism, is that Kleros cases can be subjective. I mean, it's kind of the point. So sometimes you can have a case that's appealed like a whole bunch of times and has like really close vote totals, like it's not 50-50 on every round, just because people disagree. Not because there's some like an attack or there's some fundamental split in the community over an ideological issue, but just because people, that one case is really fuzzy. And you don't necessarily want that to create a fork. So instead, in your automatic mechanism, people can both vote and they can say, this case is worth forking over, this is an attack. These people they have like weird views on what the juror guidelines are and they shouldn't be in our community anymore. Or you can say, no, this is really reasonable people disagree. This is fine, we shouldn't fork over this. And a little more nuance than that, you can by providing these sort of thresholds of like the threshold you're willing to fork to different options at, you can say, okay, yeah, I kind of think that this is like an important split of the community, and I would kind of be willing to fork over this, but I'm not willing to go alone. I'm only willing to, to go to like Kleros B if like a good chunk of the community is going with me. If really I'm butting myself with this, I can squint and be like, okay, this is close enough to being justice that I can stay in the main fork. So basically, the mechanism does is it looks for the largest possible set of coherent forks that work with people's thresholds. So if I say I'm only willing to fork to option B in my sort of example here, so I think A wins, and I want, I'm asked like what was my threshold for forking to option B. I can say, well, I'm only willing to go to option B if it has at least 30% support, and then there's this mechanism that finds the largest possible fork that meets everybody's criteria. And then you can sort of see in the example here, like there was like one person who was willing to fork to option B, but only if it had lots of support, 40% of support. And there wasn't 40% of people willing to support that option, so she winds up on option A. But these other people who are more hardcore about B having to be the right answer, they wind up on option B because it met their thresholds. Okay. So again, basically the algorithm just finds the largest possible fork that's consistent with thresholds. Finally, wrapping up, we intend to have parameters that auto-adjust, arbitration fees, deposits. So in the sort of current version, updates to parameters are made through the governance process, which is really slow. It takes several weeks just for the governance process to like go through, at which point maybe the price of ETH moved again and you would want to update the parameters again. So here we're hoping to have like parameters that update sort of in more real time. So parameters like the fee per juror and like the deposits sizes, particularly the alpha, probably the min stake would probably not update in real time. And what that means, you need oracles. So you need like oracles for like the ETH price to like, if you're targeting some generic fiat currency or some average of fiat currencies for your rewards, you need to know how much that's worth. You kind of need to know how much P and K is worth compared to ETH. You want to know typical gas costs. So there are various standard approaches to doing this, which we haven't done like tons and tons of research on like what the parameter updates will look like, but this is something we expect to happen in the next version of the court. And to some degree, it depends on like what's available in the rollup we go to. So like approaches include like Chainlink, obviously, or using some kind of rolling average of Uniswap price data. Although if you do that, you have to be really careful because it has to be resistant to flash loan attacks. But as long as you sort of have like a long enough rolling average, that can work. So again, there's sort of like a collection of existing standard approaches, and it's just a matter of picking one that works with the sort of platform Kleros is on. Thank you. So I know it took most of the hour. Do people have questions?
Just one thing I'm going to say. While you were speaking, I got like 6 or 7 people asking if this would be shared, because if it's going to be recorded, it's recorded, so we're going to share this, so don't worry. I know that's a lot to sink in, and yeah, it's going to be shared, and that was simply spectacular, William. Congratulations. And yeah, and I will leave this open for questions if someone has any.
Yeah, so like the advantages of having the explicit forking mechanism versus not having explicit forking mechanism. Like arguably forking, like having explicit mechanism makes it somewhat more likely for forking to happen. You know, if you had like a really egregious case, you know, like an obvious 51% attack, you know, just under like the social like consensus, like you could already have a fork. But maybe you have like a 51% attack that's like borderline. It's not totally clear it's a 51% attack. Like a lot of people think it is, and they'd be willing to fork, but because there's not sort of this like selling point of like, you know, like the sort of path that they go to fork, maybe it's less likely to happen. So by having an explicit mechanism, you expect to have more resistance to 51% attacks. Cool. Are there other questions?
Well, if there aren't any other questions, well, of course you can still watch this in the recording, and then if you come up with some questions, you can ask on Telegram, or you can reach William, of course. I have to say also that this was the most populated, you know, call we had so far. So I guess you have this quite some following, William. So.
Yeah. And if anybody wants more detail on these things, like the yellow paper goes into like extreme detail on all these points. So, you know, feel free to, you know, like reach my Telegram if you have questions, you know, dig into the yellow paper, watch this recording, the resources available.
There's a question there in writing, William.
Yeah, so like this is an issue. So this is another reason you might not expect to like use the proof of humanity enabled courts like immediately for all courts. You know, like this is a choice that the governance mechanism will make on a per court basis. But like, you know, maybe some jurors are comfortable like ruling in a way that's obviously tied to their real world identity. Like, you know, like already, you know, you can see an address, you might be able to guess who it is based on, you know, comments people make in Telegram and such. But that's quite different than like going to proof of humanity and like comparing the address and being like, oh yes, it's that guy, and you know, putting a face to the juror that you know voted a certain way. So it would be better, and I expect that the like proof of humanity enabled courts would be more widely applied once you have like a sort of anonymized version of proof of humanity. So we've talked about using like various tools that would allow to have like a symbol resistant like derived list where you have your like symbol resistant proof of humanity list of like everyone's like public identity. And then by virtue of being on a list, you can generate like a proof that says, okay, I have like one unique identity on this like derived list. It's not anonymized. And like, you know, it would be better to use that one for your voting. So that's you know, like that's an extra brick to build in order to get to that sort of fuller, more ideal version of the proof of humanity enabled court.
Just to add to that, William, I'm pretty sure on our incubator, in our hackathon, one of the teams was building something like that as a sort of proof of concept. Were they not? They had some sort of ZK voting on proof of humanity. It wasn't ready or anything, but was that what they were doing?
Yeah, they did. So like the second prize winner in a sort of general hackathon that Kleros co-organized with ECC was on a related topic. It's you know, it still had some like, you know, like it's an interesting project, but like, you know, in order to actually be used for this specific application, it like had some issues around having like a sort of trusted server that like sometimes, you know, what the trusted server does is like okay, and sometimes it's not okay, and it either like wouldn't work for the specific application of generating the anonymized proof of humanity list of for like anonymizing the voting, but it would work for some other applications where you want to like do stuff with an anonymized proof of humanity application without going into too much detail. So like generally, like we're pretty sure that there's like a way to do this problem of anonymizing proof of humanity. It's sort of a question of like which zero knowledge technique is like more efficient, you know, but you know, like there's stuff to be researched and developed, but it's like pretty clear that there's a path to eventually doing that.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you a lot, William, for this amazing presentation. And well, the rest, if you have more questions, feel free to reach. And this is what we are working out, like translating all of this research into the specs of what is going to be the second version of the court. So, well, that's it for today. And see you guys on Telegram.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, William. See you guys later.
Thanks. See you.
Thanks, William.